Right. I wanted to make a quick video on the fake moon landings. My friend Vox Day recently put up a blog post, which was, I think, sparked off by a video by Owen Benjamin. I don't know Owen. I think he's called Big Bear. I've only seen a couple of his videos, but I really like the guy. He's I think we've got something similar in that I don't know his story, but from what I've picked up here and there from the two videos I've watched, I think he didn't used to be a Christian, or he was a very lax one, and now he is a pretty hardcore one, I think, or proper one, and I can relate to that quite a lot. Anyway, the thing is, Owen Benjamin says we didn't go to the moon. It's a fake thing. They faked the moon landings and so on. Vox Day is more agnostic, and he basically says he doesn't know. What he does know is that the official story of having gone to the moon has got so many holes in it, it can't be true. So there's something dodgy going on. Maybe they did go, maybe they didn't go. What he's sure of is the official story doesn't hold water. Now, my position, and I've had this for a long time, is they're both kind of wrong and they're both kind of right, in the sense that, well, actually Vox isn't really wrong. He's just doesn't have a piece that I think I have. So my thought on this is the moon landings were absolutely faked. Most of the video and the photographs that you see were done by Stanley Kubrick. It's pretty well known, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that these things are faked. Having said that, I do believe they did go to the moon. They just didn't go the way they told you they went to the moon. And the reason that I say this, and I'm not going to give you a lot of evidence and details and so on, because over 20 years ago now, about 22 years ago, I wrote a 460-page book, and then it was updated in 2014, so it's now over 500 pages. So you want to know the details of this stuff, it's right in here. Now, when I wrote this, I was 26, and I started writing The Face on Mars as a fiction book. But for me, science fiction is a lot of science, a little bit of fiction. So I did a lot of research, and in doing that research, I realized that what I thought were just a bunch of rocks that look a bit like a face are definitely artificial. I have since been permitted to say that Mark Carlotto, who I'm just gonna get one of his books, this guy. So this is one of his later books. Mark Carlotto is a guy I met as a result of having written The Face on Mars, and meeting him in London when we both did a speech to over 500 people or so on. Some of it was televised as well. Anyway, Mark Carlotto is a brilliant scientist. This guy, he was involved in some really interesting scientific work. He developed algorithms that look at satellite imagery, looking for non-fractal objects to spot camouflaged military vehicles in war theaters. So he was eminently placed to understand whether the face on Mars, the images of the face on Mars were showing artificial objects or natural objects. And when he ran his program over it, the Cydonia stuff just flares up. So anyway, Mark was, at the first time I met him, when I got one of his books, and his book was part of my research in writing my book. And then I gave him a copy of my book. The second time I met him a year later, he'd read my book, and he concluded that I was probably onto something. I never stated what he told me privately, which he was almost certainly sure it was artificial. But when I asked him the first time, he was very true scientist. He said, I don't know. I'm doing the work, and the work that I've done states that the probability that that thing is artificial is over 95%. So in theory, scientifically, that should be accepted as being artificial. But personally, I'm still agnostic. A couple of years later, new images came out, and he told me, I've got an email somewhere stored on one of my computers where he says it's definitely artificial. Because when I saw that image, and it was reversed, it was called the cat box image. When it was reversed in that, NASA printed like a reversed image that was faded and so on. But by then, we both knew how to manipulate images, although I'm nowhere near his level. And I wrote to him and I said, what do you think? Because I think it's artificial. And he said, it's definitely artificial. But I never mentioned his name because, you know, he had a reputation to uphold. And since I wrote the book, I've been approached by pretty hectic people, daughters of admirals, actual astronomers that are involved in placing equipment on the European Space Agency satellites. And these guys came to me and privately told me, you're right, you're telling the truth, but I can't support you publicly because otherwise I'll be out of a job. I understand that, and you know, I've never revealed these sort of things. But some years ago, I caught up with Mark again, and we spoke briefly. I can't remember if it was on the phone or an email, but and he told me, "You're okay. If you want to say that I say it's artificial, go ahead and do it. I don't care. I'm 100% behind you," sort of thing. And he's a guy that I respect a lot from a purely scientific point of view. So, you know, it's not just me saying it. But anyway, when I wrote that book, I came across a bunch of other stuff. And what I came across was anti-gravity technology. So I do believe they've gone to the moon, but they didn't go to the moon the way they say they went to the moon. And most of the footage is completely faked and done in a studio. Now, there are some interesting parts to this. For example, if you see the LEM when it takes off from the moon, you know, they supposedly left a camera on the moon that shows the lunar module floating up. And that's exactly what it does. You see the explosive bolts bursting, and then you see the LEM just floating up. There's no jet propulsion, there's no dust, you know. Now, keep in mind, the moon is supposed to have 1/6 the gravity of Earth, and you know, you need a Saturn V rocket to shoot all that stuff up there. Now, admittedly, the lunar module is much smaller, but it's still classified. You still cannot find exact details of what was in that lunar module. There's a bunch of details. They tell you that it weighed about 15 tons wet, and about 4 tons dry, 5 tons when it had some other equipment like the moon buggy and so on. But that really only leaves you between 10 and 11,000 kilograms of fuel to take off from the moon. Now, there's some engineers out there, I'm sure they can do the maths, right? Do the maths. Just some of you guys that are into astrophysics and so on, you've got 10,000 kilograms of fuel to take off from the moon. Do you get off the moon doing that? Just asking a question, right? And remember that in order to land on the moon, yeah, we're told that Neil Armstrong used up almost all the fuel that he had to land on. So however much fuel you've got, it's got to be less than 10,000 or 11,000, more or less, depending on which one you're using. Let's use the 11,000 kilograms of fuel, right? But some of that has been used up on landing. And we're told that he had almost zero fuel left for landing. So however much fuel you've got to take off is going to be less than that. And yet, you don't see any flame, you don't see any rocket exhaust, you don't see any dust from the platform of where the lunar module takes off, because half of the lunar module became the platform for when the lunar module took off. It just kind of floats up. Now, the interesting thing is that there was the Apollo program was built by Nazis. Wernher von Braun was a full-on Nazi, and there's another guy who's really a bit more interesting than Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun is the guy that everybody talks about. But there's a guy called Kurt DeBus, or DeBus. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's D-E-B-U-S. Kurt with a K, Kurt DeBus. And he was an electrical engineer. So now the Nazis were definitely researching anti-gravity technology. I believe they had anti-gravity technology. And I believe that their submarines eventually morphed into essentially flying saucers. If you're interested into that sort of stuff, it is in my book, The Face on Mars. But a guy that's gone a lot more detail of it is a guy called Joseph Farrell, which I've been in touch with. He's written several books. The two that I think are the most interesting are Rise of the Black Sun, because it gives you sort of a background with a lot of, and this guy, you know, has got a lot of documentation, so it's not just his opinions. And the other one is the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. The books are, in some sense, not very well written in that they don't exactly flow, because he does sort of jump from one thing to another, but he has a lot of references and he brings up a lot of bits of data and he puts them together. So I can't really fault him for the fact that his writing doesn't flow very much. It's not an easy read, but it's a very interesting read. And this other guy who has done even more research, and Joseph Farrell refers to this guy quite a few times, and that's Henry Stevens. This book called Dark Star is all about the hidden history of German secret bases, flying discs, and U-boats. Now, I have also, of course, written some fiction books, and I'm going to just quickly show them to you. This was the original cover of my Overlords of Mars series, which I'm stuck at halfway to book 3. I've written the first 2 books, and I just haven't had the time to finish book 3 because it's a really convoluted plot lines and so on. And I then changed the cover because I thought, oh, well, you know, for a moment there I hesitated and I thought maybe I should be a bit more politically correct. And also, the weird thing is that the books I've written for the Overlords of Mars there's 3 books that I'm gonna write. There is gonna be a 4th one further down the line, but each one of the books, weirdly enough, had a dream as an origin. I had a dream that then just stayed with me until I write the book out. And in the first dream, it was a kind of a weird dream. You know, I dreamt that I was weird. I didn't plan this, but I remember wearing this kind of a top, and aliens had arrived on Earth, and it turned out they were humans, and they were descending on sort of like a little floating platform. And I remember this woman, you know, she was a human, but they came from the stars or whatever, and all the humans on this little floating sled were beautiful, you know, men and women. They were sort of prime examples of beautiful human beings. And I remember looking at this woman thinking, oh wow, she's so beautiful. And I thought, we're probably like monkeys to them. And I remember her turning and seeing her eyes, his blue eyes, and hearing her voice in my mind saying, no, you can be just like us. You just have to have some things released in your mind, and you can be just like us. You're not monkeys to us. So like telepathically, she was telling me this, and I felt sort of like a little bit ashamed, you know, of this woman that was so pretty that could read my mind. And I thought, you know, I felt honestly like a savage, and I am pretty much a savage. But anyway, so that dream prompted the original book, the first book. And over time, I thought, you know, I'm going to change the book, and I'm going to put a cover that more reflects a little bit more my dream. And I don't know if you can see, that's Mars, and that's the real Mars with a texture that was put there by a Dutch guy who's done a lot of covers for National Geographic and so on. He takes the real data of the Martian surface and he renders it. And he very, very kindly allowed me to use this for my cover free of charge. He just said, you know, send me a couple of books, and that's what I did. And you'll see the woman's eyes there. Now, there's a girl I knew back then, and it just turned out, you know, I wrote this in 2011, I think, and you know, we're now 2018, and she's now my wife. That's just kind of how it worked out. But I'd looked for eyes of a model or something that would work, and they just didn't work. And her eyes had this picture of hers that just worked, so I changed it. And then this came the second book, the Overlords of Mars series. And there's a third book, and you know, basically these books are, yes, Nazis on the moon, which, you know, you sort of think, oh, it's crazy theory and all that, and you know, they are fiction books. But weirdly enough, there's a lot of stuff in these fiction books that is not as much fiction as people think it is. You know, there's a lot of stuff about the moon landings that doesn't make any sense. Like, all of the pictures we know now are doctored. They are absolutely fake. And there is plenty of evidence for that. You know, Google is not your friend, but it'll still bring up quite a lot of stuff, and otherwise use DuckDuckGo. You will find a lot of evidence that the moon landing stuff is absurd. I mean, how do you figure that America gives a moon rock to the Netherlands and it turns out to be petrified trees? You know, that's slightly embarrassing. You know, a little bit like when the Germans wanted their gold back from Fort Knox, the gold that was put there just before World War II, and it was used to finance all sorts of dodgy stuff. And took the Americans a couple of years to even bother to respond and give it back. And eventually, when they sent the first shipment of the gold back, turned out to be titanium plated with gold. So gold bars that weren't gold bars. They just had a thin layer of gold, and then you drill down and it's something else. And I don't know why they use titanium, if I remember right, because I think it's got a different specific weight to gold, so a bit dumb. But how do you explain that? And why isn't it front page news? You know, why doesn't CNN, right, put this stuff all over the place? It turns out there's 3 lines on the 7th page of, like, you know, some, I don't know, the Financial Times or something, you know, deep, buried deep somewhere there. Mainstream media doesn't cover this stuff. Why? Why is that, right? You'd think it would be news. Or like the bearer bonds that were actually genuine, worth a couple of billion, that got caught crossing the border between Switzerland and Italy, but some Japanese guys, I think it was, you know, this kind of weird stuff that just doesn't get talked about. But why would America give petrified trees to the Netherlands pretending it's moon rock? I mean, you gotta ask yourself this stuff. And you gotta work out, you know, can the lunar module float back up to lunar orbit with less than 10,000 kilograms of fuel? Just do the maths, right? You gotta shoot 4.2 tons into lunar orbit using less than 10,000 kilograms of fuel. Use whatever fuel you want, whatever rocket you want. So no, I think what happened is that there is anti-gravity technology. And by the way, not to blow my own horn too much, I know I'm showing you a lot of my books, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is that I want to support both Fox Day and Owen Benjamin with the reality that they're telling people, because you are brainwashed. Now, I am a qualified hypnotist, and I've hypnotized a lot of people, and I have worked with some of the top hypnotists on the planet. I'm also probably one of the only hypnotists on the world that's read just about everything that Milton Erickson has written, including documents that are not easily available. I have literally spent about 4 or 5 months, 8 hours a day, reading everything that I could find that Milton Erickson wrote. I am a really good hypnotist, and it's amazing what you can do with that stuff if you know, if you're unethical. Milton Erickson was ethical, thank God, and because of that, Milton Erickson, you know, also produced the idea that you cannot hypnotize somebody to do anything that they wouldn't normally do anyway, which is an absolute lie. But Milton Erickson did that in a very ethical way. He didn't actually lie, technically, and he did it because he wanted to protect people from the predatory things that you can do if you're an unethical person with hypnosis. I have refrained from speaking about this very much, although on my blog it mentions it here and there. But I think that the time has come where people need to understand that, you know, that thing sitting on your shelf called the TV is basically brainwashing you. You hear a story and you believe it. You know, it's like when you're a little kid and you're told that whatever, you know, the moon's made of cheese. You don't know any better. You grow up believing that. And eventually when somebody tells you the moon's not made of cheese, you laugh at them and you go, oh, you're stupid. This is a point that Owen Benjamin is very, it's part of the reason why I made a video, because Owen Benjamin brought up hypnosis. Apparently his dad was involved in hypnosis and is somebody who understands this, and he's taught Owen about this since he was a kid. And it's absolutely true. You know, the level of unreality that you can make a person live by is absurd, is really hard to define. But it's true, unfortunately. And going back to anti-gravity and why people think anti-gravity is not possible, when I was in my 20s, I grew up since I was a kid reading astronomy books for fun and physics books for fun. And you know, I knew what I liked here when I was 4 years old, because I was lucky enough to have a maternal uncle that actually, you know, he was a nerd, completely a nerd, but a really good guy. And whenever I had questions that neither one of my parents could answer, and I'd ask him, what's a star and how does it work? And he'd explain to me, you know, as a little kid, little kids are, you know, they're logical. Explain to me what a light year was, how a light year worked, and that meant how far the stars were. So I've grown up knowing this stuff and really being interested in it. You know, I wanted to believe the moon landings more than anybody. Don't get me wrong. I want there to have been moon landings. I believe there have been moon landings. I believe we probably have moon bases. I believe we probably have bases even on Mars. We're just not told about it. And there's a really, I forgot the guy's name. You know, I don't know. Maybe if I research it, I'll put it on below the video on the blog. There's a guy who's he takes videos of what he supposedly are these huge spaceships in the sky with a telescope, and he posts them online. And there's also a very interesting thing about that British hacker, and again I forgot his name, but it's very well known. If you just Google it, you'll find it. British hacker who supposedly found lists of military personnel based on spaceships. And the US has tried to extradite this guy for years. You know, he's a little bit autistic and he's a really good hacker apparently, but he found these lists of these ships that are in space and have military personnel aboard. And I think he might have also found some pictures of the moon with weird stuff on it that he didn't know how to explain. I absolutely believe that anti-gravity technology has been developed. Not believe, it's a fact. Okay, and again, I refer you back to this book. A guy called Thomas Townsend Brown invented anti-gravity, or rediscovered anti-gravity, and created anti-gravity discs, and his patents are in here. The patent numbers of his inventions are in here. Now these discs flew just by being powered by electricity, and there's a video somewhere of him like linking these things up, and you just see this metal disc just flying about. And apparently they performed even better in vacuum than they did in atmosphere. And in the book I explain how this works, because if you can create anti-gravity fields or gravity fields, whichever way you want to think of it, you can accelerate to speeds that are and have been recorded by the space shuttle. There's recordings of what is essentially a weapons test apparently, or shooting of a UFO. And Mark Carlotta has done some work on this. There's a guy called Richard Hoagland, and I don't put much stock in Richard Hoagland because he's a kind of a journalist, and some of you will know my feelings about journalists. But Richard Hoagland talked about a piece of footage which was filmed from the space shuttle, where you basically see these two objects enter the atmosphere and being fired upon by these really fast flying projectiles, and the two spaceships quickly change direction and run off. Now Mark Carlotto did a scientific investigation of this, and Richard Hoagland took it and then just talked about it without even checking with Mark whether that was okay to do or not. The thing is that Mark's science is awesome, it's good, and Mark could prove that the distance of these objects, and from that, therefore, you could figure out, because we knew where the space shuttle was, you could figure out the speed of these things. And on the basis of that, the directional change of this flying craft would put anything inside it under 14,000 Gs of pressure. Now, that would make it into a thin layer of jam, right? Unless you can counter it by having a counter-gravity field inside the craft that is, computer controlled, so that whatever gravity field you produce outside the craft to change your direction, you produce a counter-gravity field inside the craft to get rid of the momentum. And you could be sipping tea and not even spilling a drop while your spaceship changes direction to the tune of 14,000 gravities of momentum if you didn't have the field. Anti-gravity absolutely exists. Thomas Townsend Brown discovered it in 1924 or 28, I think, before it was published. He was a high school student at the time. He developed it and redeveloped it. He had private investors in it that died before they could go further with it. So in 1954, Thomas Townsend Brown gave his discovery, if you like, to the US Naval Research Laboratories, and since then nobody's heard a damn thing about it. Which connected also to the Tesla papers, which were taken from the US government after Tesla died. All these papers were simply taken by the US government and disappeared. And apparently Tesla also had like flying dustbins that they call them flying dustbins. It's sort of like a little one-man portable thing that he used to fly around in. So anti-gravity definitely exists, and the US military has had since 1954 to look into it. But the Nazis, with the Nazi bell and so on, they were trying to develop this stuff in the end of the Second World War, and I believe they made advances in that. I don't believe that the Roswell object was a UFO from aliens. I think it was a Nazi UFO. So there's a little missing information there, which once you know about it, once you know that anti-gravity technology exists and is possible, then the moon landings suddenly can be explained. Um, I still think that the footage is almost entirely fake. If there is some footage that isn't fake, it's probably small parts of it. But if we did go to the moon, we went using anti-gravity technology, which was inside at least the LEM. There's another very important point about anti-gravity technology. If you can create these very strong fields, gravity fields, and therefore also electromagnetic fields, you can be shielded from the Van Allen radiation belts and radiation in general. In my fiction books, I also mention how theoretically you could use these gravity creating machines to literally create shields as such. I mean, you could keep a certain level of gravity on the moon, regardless of what the gravity on the moon is. You could create a field that creates a gravity of, one gravity, so that you are at Earth normal. There's a lot of stuff you can do if you can create gravity fields at will. And I believe that we have that technology. It's a very dangerous technology, and for a long time, and I mentioned this in the Face on Mars, for a long time, I also thought there's good reasons to keep this technology under wraps, because literally, let's say somebody had a car-sized anti-gravity machine that works the way I described. In about 2 hours, you can render the whole planet to a slag heap. Because with one of these things, you can fly out there, pick a nice-sized asteroid, redirect it, and aim it at Earth. Now, you think atom bombs are a weapon. They're not. A 30-kilometer asteroid traveling at 30 kilometers per second, that's a weapon. That'll wipe out pretty much all life on Earth. And it doesn't have to be 30 kilometers across. It could be 50 kilometers across. It could be 100 kilometers across. And you can accelerate it to 100 kilometers per second. If these machines work the way that I believe they work, you can do that. So you don't want every crazy dictator and every crazy bastard that's got the money creating these things willy-nilly, so that there needs to be a control on it. But who can and who should, who watches the watchman type of thing. The point is that on this planet, it essentially is a prison planet, and the way they make the prison is in your own mind. They lie to you. I mean, the average person actually believes that 9/11 happened the way they tell you it happened. It's absolute nonsense. I don't know of a single civil engineer, and that's what I studied, civil engineering. I don't know of a single civil engineer that actually knows his job. They can explain to me why, Building 7 collapsed, or even why the two towers collapsed. They can't. And in fact, there are something like 14,000 engineers that have compiled a document that says, we don't agree with the official story. 9/11 is bullshit. It didn't fall down the way it said it fall down. The buildings don't just spontaneously collapse on their own footprint. And I did my final thesis on air blast and building demolition. So, when I saw that happen, when I saw it happen on TV, I was in a shopping center. Everybody more or less remembers where they were when 9/11 happened. I saw it happen and I thought, shit, World War III is kicking off, because what they're telling us there, that's not planes that did that. Something else is going on. And at the time, I really thought, man, we're in for, I don't know what's going to happen next. And, then I understood very shortly after that it was a power play, a false flag to, take over power, and that's what they did. Or, if you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald really shot JFK, again, you're a moron. You either have absolutely no conception of firearms and shooting and distances and that sort of thing. I grew up shooting firearms. Lee Harvey Oswald did not shoot JFK, all right? 9/11 did not happen the way it tell you it happened, right? And I'm not saying, that there aren't elements of it that are true or whatever, but the official story is a lie. You got to understand that. I mean, look at what happened World War II. Like what kicked off that? What made the Nazis take over power? I mean, they had the Reichstag fire. That was a false flag. You can laugh all you want, but the so-called conspiracy theory of history holds water and has been proven right time and time and time and time again. So if you want to trust the US government, just remember, they used to feed radioactive pills to handicapped kids just to see what radioactivity would do to people. Yeah, that's your government. Trust the government, yeah. Checks in the mail and you know what the other one is. So I just wanted to add a little element to both what Vox Day and Owen Benjamin are saying. Vox is a friend of mine, and I know that probably means, you know, people are going to think I'm some weird Nazi white supremacist or whatever. It's pretty tough to try and make me out to be that because of my family, my background, where I grew up, the women I've been with. It's really, you want to accuse me of being some kind of white supremacist racist, you're going to have a really tough time, you know. But no doubt some of you will try that. Anyway, that's basically it. It's a longer video than most of the ones I've done. And don't worry, I'll get back to pedophile Bergoglio and his satanic henchmen probably quite soon.